Welcome to the DPS 101 podcast. This is the podcast version of the DPS 101 Community Leadership course, which gives members of our community a chance to learn directly from the highest-ranking leaders in Denver public schools. The course is designed to give you a behind-the-scenes look at how the school district operates, as well as a lesson in leadership from our leaders. I'm Nicole Brady, Communications and Community Engagement Manager, and my guest today, this is episode 3 of DPS 101, is Chuck Carpenter, who is the Chief of Finance for DPS. Thanks so much for being here, Chuck.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here, and hopefully this is interesting for folks in the community.
I think school finance is fascinating. It probably would take hours, if not years, to understand it, but we only have about 30 minutes today.
Yes.
So we'll try to keep the focus on some of the big picture and really how people can understand better how the money that they pay in taxes affects our students here in DPS. So Chuck, to start, another aspect of DPS 101 is learning a little bit about leadership and learning about the leaders in our district. So we'd love if you would just give us a short biography. Chuck, to start here, how did you end up heading up finances in DPS? Because I know you actually started as a teacher, which is maybe not the traditional path for a CFO.
That's true. So I went to college at a small liberal arts school in Indiana, DePaul University, and after that I did a program called Teach for America, and so I taught in rural Louisiana for 2 years. It was an amazing experience, and certainly, for me, just a totally different environment, totally different culture, and I love that, and I still think about that a lot. And so 2 years in rural Louisiana, Baton Rouge would have been the closest city, but I was actually teaching in a community close to Mississippi on the Mississippi border. And then my wife's from Boulder, moved out here, started working for DPS, and that was in 2008. So I've been with DPS it'll be 18 years this June, and I've had a lot of different roles in finance. I guess you could say I worked my way up in the finance office here at DPS. I've had a lot of great mentors and other leaders here, not, certainly in DPS, and I'd say that primarily, but also just in the Colorado community and then other places too, where you meet folks and you learn from them. So that's my story.
Can I ask, because you started as a teacher and you came here and worked for DPS, did you, from those formative experiences, did you decide you wanted to be in education finance, or was that an accident?
I think I'm a first generation college student, and so it's just been an important part of my life. And my parents sort of, I think this is true for a lot of people that end up in education. It's part of their family or others. It's just a really important part. I've always just found tremendous value in education, in public education, and just in learning in general. And so, I always had interest in finance and in economics. And so I don't know if I wouldn't say this was all part of the plan. That's not what I would say. But as I got into it, certainly I've loved the work and still love the work and love the work we do today.
Yeah, and it's so impactful, of course, perhaps more so than working for a Fortune 500 company. You oversee, well, let's break down this number here. It's a $1.5 billion general fund at DPS. Then there's additional funds from bonds that the community passes, from grants, things like that. Of course, most of us know as a public school district, we're funded by tax dollars. Can you give us a general overview of where all the money is coming from?
Yeah, and I think you've explained this well. Like, there's about $1.5 billion in the general fund. That's sort of the fund that's running the programming in schools. There's another $250-ish million that are paying our bonds that are for capital. And then there's another $100-ish million that are grants. And so, it's approaching, almost $2 billion at this point. And that's sort of how it is all, that's mainly how the funds are broken down. Most of this money comes from property taxes. About $1 billion of it is from property taxes, and the state pitches in most of the rest of it. So that's sort of how it adds up.
Federal funding is part of that too.
Federal funding is part of that. I mean, we get about $70 million in grants that we get every year, like Title I for students in poverty, Title II, which is for teacher training, Title III, which is for language learners. And so we get a lot of federal funding, but it's, I would never say that $70 million is a lot of money, but it certainly isn't the largest part. The largest part is definitely property tax owners in Denver.
Wow. Well, that's very interesting. Now, the amount of money DPS receives does depend on enrollment. The state has a per pupil funding number. So that's why we always hear concerns about declining enrollment? Because that does impact the budget.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, I think it is often said that school finance is really complicated. And I think, lower you get on it, that's true. There are a lot of sort of weird nuances in school finance. But I do think at its most basic level, and I think this is a good way to understand it, is you have the number of kids you're serving, there's money attached to that, and then that's what basically our revenue is. And so there's students, money comes with them. That's largely the revenue we get. We take that revenue and we spend it on the things that people see for the most part. You see, the school building itself. You see the parking lot. You see the gymnasium. You see all the teachers and the principal at a particular school. And so we get money in for all the kids that come and we spend it on the people that are providing that programming. And so it is complicated, but it also isn't. And I think that's basically how it works.
Well, let's get into how the money is spent in DPS. So I believe I've seen a figure that about 70% is spent just in schools, the things you just mentioned that we see every day. Teachers, technology, resources, all of that. Can you give an overview of what all that entails?
Yeah. So, and Nicole, you're talking about, we have this chart that says schools 70%, field 20, and central 10. And the 70% you're referencing is basically all the money that the school leaders have in their budgets.
Got it.
And so that includes, things that, for the most part, is what is seen if you're a parent or a guardian walking around a school. That's the teachers, that's the paper and the copier, that's the gym, that's all the stuff that's going on in a particular school. So that's 70% of the money is directly in a principal's budget. If you're a guardian or a parent and you're on the CSC, that's the money that you're in charge of, or that you're not in charge of, but that you're sort of advising on. So that's the 70%. And then we say this 20%, we call it field. And that means it's in the field. That's things like the buses, that's the custodial, that's the utility bills. There are some programs, there's some specialized programs for students, and just not calling anything out, but just to make an example of speech language folks that help particular students. That's not in a principal's budget because it's kind of a specialized service, but it is literally a service that's delivered at a school.
Got it.
So I think, upwards of 90% of all of our budget is actually spent on the physical locations of a school. And then there's about 10% that is central office. And, that's the stuff that is at the headquarters of, most companies. That's a lot of my team, which is, accounting, budgeting, purchasing. You also have all of your HR functions, your IT functions, the superintendent's office. Those kinds of things are in the central office.
Yeah, the smallest portion of the budget there. So,
as it should be.
Yeah, absolutely. Keeping those numbers in check is important, and I know that's important to you. So the district spends plenty of the money, as it should, on teachers. Teacher pay is an issue that comes up a lot. I think most people think teachers aren't paid enough. It's not necessarily something that the district always has control over. You negotiate that with their union. In DPS's case, it's the DCTA. Can you talk a little bit about that process so that when we hear about the district paying teachers more, where that money's coming from?
Yeah, I mean, this is something we pay a lot of attention to. It's our largest expense. It is our largest group of employees is our classroom teachers, and so we're constantly benchmarking how we're paying teachers against other communities in Colorado and other school districts. And I think I'm like most people. I wish we were paying our teachers as best we possibly can. A lot of this is a function of our revenues and how much we can get out there. And we certainly negotiate. You mentioned the negotiations with the Classroom Teachers Association, and they're a very sophisticated party. And they also know that, we can only spend what we have. And so we're, constantly trying to push that number up in a responsible way.
How often do those negotiations come up?
I mean, they could be every year,
okay.
But lately we've been on 3-year cycles where we, you can't, it's not really that realistic to go more than a couple of years in the future because there's just so much that happens, and you don't want to be locked in on either side, right? You don't want to be locked in when you have the opportunity to pay your teachers more, and you don't want to be locked in should the budgets go the other direction.
And we'll get into some other alternative funding sources a little bit later for that. But another piece that the district is responsible for, and it's a big one, is retirement accounts, para, for employees. Is that right?
Well, retirement is one of the biggest expenses that we have. DPS used to run its own retirement system called the Denver Public Schools retirement system. This is a bill of an archive comment, but since about 2009, that retirement plan merged with para, and so DPS has its sort of own division within para, and so essentially, state legislature sets a contribution rate, and so every year we're contributing that. Employees are also contributing, so the employer has a contribution rate, the employee has a contribution rate. That's governed by statute, and so we basically send that money to para. Para is its own organization. So DPS doesn't really manage the pension. We don't actually manage it at all. Para manages it. And Para's, they're a retirement system, but they're really just a big hedge fund. They have all of the assets from all of the districts. From all school districts, schools division, DPS, judicial, state and local government. It's a huge fund, and they, at the General Assembly has sort of tasked para. The General Assembly, being the state legislature, has tasked para with running this retirement system. And the DPS division is over 90% funded, which is a great rate for a pension. And it's a very safe retirement. And people should be confident that if you're a DPS division member of para, that your retirement is safe.
The great news for everyone listening. Before we move on to some of the other funding sources like bonds and such, I want to talk about your team at DPS. You're not the only person there, obviously, even though it does seem like you're always working. Yes. Can you talk about the size of your team and what everyone is doing on that team?
Well, the DPS finance team, I think, is going to resemble a lot of finance teams around really any large company. And you mentioned how big of a company we are in terms of like our revenue and our general fund. But the different types of functions we have a accounting team, as you would expect every company. We have a budgeting team, a payroll team. We have an internal audit team, which sort of like is taking on investigations and making sure that we are doing things with the highest integrity. We have a procurement team. So when we're out procuring things like curriculum or some of our construction contracts for our bonds or technology softwares that we're implementing, we go through an RFP process for many of our procurements, and that team runs that. That's attached to our accounts payable team. So there's a number of different functions that our finance team does. One thing that is under finance in DPS is enrollment and campus planning, and I think that might be different than some school districts. But I don't mean to monetize this overly, but I think enrollment, as we talked about, is sort of the source of most of our revenues, and I think that the ability to plan for students and to sort of connect those two things, I think, has a lot of sense. That being said, if it was done differently, that'd be reasonable too. But I think there's a lot of reasons why finance and enrollment are very connected from a strategy standpoint.
That's very, very interesting. Andrew Huber, who is the head of enrollment and campus planning, I know is constantly adjusting things. We work with him on the communications team to find out kind of what's new, what's interesting, what's going on, but things are always kind of in flux and being planned. But give us an example, like air conditioning. That would have been something where they worked very closely, I imagine, with the finance team.
Yeah, I mean, this is, and that's sort of on, that sort of has a lot of intersections. That has an intersection with our construction team. It has intersections with our budgeting team, and then also our procurement team. And so you sort of identifying the schools that need air conditioning, going out, sort of getting a sense of the market on what it would take to budget for such a project. Some of these projects are going in at schools that are, almost by definition very old, because they were built before air conditioning was a sort of standard part of the specifications of a building. And so you're knocking down walls that were built sometimes 50 years ago, and sometimes surprises for what's behind those walls. But and then the procurement team would put out a request for proposals, basically, that says, hey, we're going to do air conditioning at these 2 or 3 schools. Contractors, general contractors, are you interested, and what would the cost be?
So how does your team make sure all other departments at DPS stay fiscally responsible? I know my boss will say if he spends over a certain amount, I mean, that someone will catch that pretty quickly.
Well, it's all of our responsibilities. Like, I think this, like, the culture at the top really matters. Starting with Dr. Morero, certainly I want to model this, that we're using money that taxpayers have given us for the education of the children in this community. And I think everything that we're doing needs to have that in mind. And there are things that are a little bit more adult-centric, like professional development or like professional conferences that are, reasonable expenses in the service of that goal. But I think at the bottom line, like, you got to really be able to defend everything you're doing is supporting children. And so I think the culture at the top really matters on that. Our systems, so I think everyone's responsible for being a good fiscal manager and having integrity with what they're spending things on. That being said, a good finance team in K-12 or anywhere else will have financial controls that are automated and through our technologies that will basically identify when there's budget overages or when there are unusual expenses, and it'll flag those things. And part of the budgeting team, they'll identify those budget variances. These are the technical accounting team. Technical accounting team would be diagnostic controls.
Wow.
And, they'll see those variances and they'll bring them up with the leaders and in some cases with me. And, I think that's other situations are when there are P cards that are not reconciled. When someone swipes a Visa card and that's not immediately reconciled within a few days, we'll identify that. We'll reach out to the leader. So there's just a lot, and technology has gotten us so much better at this, right? Not to sort of, whenever someone says, back in the day, you get these paper statements from Visa and so like we're well beyond that, and the technology has been improved, and a lot of this stuff. One of the ways that technology has really advanced is you have these abilities to catch things that you wouldn't have in the past, and we're taking advantage of that.
Incredible, and that's so reassuring. I would hope to any person out there listening that technology, AI, perhaps even, is helping your team track these expenses. So, well, let's move on to another key piece of school funding here, and that would be bonds, because this is something everyone learns about. Usually about every 4 years, voters are asked to approve a bond. And in DPS's case, voters did approve overwhelmingly a nearly $1 billion bond in 2024. When you go out for a bond, you have to be fully transparent, first off, telling people what that money will be spent on. So how do you kind of come up with that to begin with?
Well, I mean, this is again an element of trust with DPS and the community. And I think DPS, and this predates me and the policy, we're standing on the shoulders of people who have done a really good job over the years. But really, for the last 2 generations of kids, DPS voters have always approved bonds. And I think one of the reasons is because they know what that money is for. It's not a blank check. To just go back to our last process, in about January of 2024, we kicked off this very large community process where we essentially said, here's all the projects across all of our buildings that we think need to be done over the next, 4 years. And a lot of those were air conditioning. You mentioned air conditioning. We have a new school we're building in the far Northeast because there's a lot of housing development in the far Northeast. There's a lot of just old maintenance things that need to be done, sidewalks, piping. There's a lot more electrical draws on buildings with all the technology and all the plugs that need to be there. And so buildings that were built a long time ago need to have electrical upgrades. We're also putting in new athletic and activities things like new fields, new performance spaces. So all those things sort of get thrown into the pot. The community will provide feedback, and some of this feedback is really good. Like, this community has just got this new school. Maybe we need to have more resources in other parts of the city. And I think one of our strengths is that this is not a leadership directed process. Mm-hmm. The community really builds these budgets. Certainly our expertise and input is valuable because, it's probably not reasonable to think that the community is going to have a sense of when do we need to do electrical upgrades and roof upgrades and things like that. So our facilities teams brings a lot of that expertise to bear. But I think the strength is that the community really gets to set these budgets in a very real way, obviously within an envelope. And so that's, to me, the real strength of this. And, I think we've been very transparent over the years. Folks can go online, see the exact projects, see the progress along those projects, and also see historically what we've done. So I think the strength has been how much we've taken our hands off of this and let the community lead what needs to be done.
Yeah.
So I hope we continue to have success, but, what we need to do is deliver on our promises at this point. The bond was passed in 2024. For us to, substantially complete all those projects by 2028 is sort of the promise we've made. And, keeping that promise will be what leads us hopefully to success in the future.
Interesting. So the goal is to complete the projects you asked for in 2024 before you go out for yet another bond.
I mean, there's always some sort of lingering things that you can't totally complete. But yes, of all that money that was approved, we're going to be substantially through it, by 2020. And I think that's a reasonable thing for the community to expect. It's like, hey, we just gave you that money. Spend that money before you come back and ask us for more.
Well, and like you said, a lot of it is some of it's construction from the ground up. I should have mentioned bonds, of course, are capital improvements only. So physical things, you cannot spend bond money on teacher pay, for example.
Right.
A lot of people know that, but maybe some don't. Why do school districts need to take this on, though? And you take on a few other forms of debt as well, something called certificates of participation, for example. You have some other financing mechanisms to make sure DPS has the funding it needs for really critical projects. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, most Western states are set up in a way that the general fund is funding the programs, and then to the extent you're going to add capital projects or build schools, you're sort of asking for this supplemental funding source. And in Colorado, you have to go back to voters for that. I think that's a reasonable thing. But that's how a lot of Western states and their constitutions are funded. That's not so much true in cities like Boston or Detroit or Chicago, where a lot of it runs through the general fund. So that's a distinction between Western states and other places. But the capital funds are usually for the physical environment. And so that's when we're asking for bonds, we're really asking for the physical plant or the building of a school. You mentioned some other forms of debt. The biggest other piece of debt that DPS has, and it's called a certificate of participation, which is a lease financing mechanism. That is largely how we merged with PARA. I mentioned the DPSRS. So what we did is we issued those certificates. We fully funded our pension and handed it over to PARA and said, all right, PARA, we're giving you a fully funded pension. And then DPS is going to pay those off through 2039. So once we get to 2039, which, still seems like a decent ways off from here, but it's getting closer every year, obviously, we'll have dropped our obligations way down. And there won't really be much of a footprint from certificates of participation at that point.
Wow. The district may also ask voters this year, 2026, to approve a mill levy override, which is different than a bond. Sometimes you see them on a ballot together.
Yeah.
This year, it would just be the MLO. What is that?
Yeah, a mill levy override, and this is another financing mechanism. So the state sets your per pupil funding. You mentioned that earlier. Communities also have the opportunity to go out and essentially incur taxes on themselves for really anything that a school district would want to identify. You could do this you could say, we're going to expand arts programming. We're going to expand activities and athletics. We're going to expand mental health. Like really anything that you could imagine, within the reasonable frame of a school building. And voters can essentially say, yeah, I'm good with that taxation for that particular purpose. Now, the board is the one who would ultimately decide. And essentially what they're doing is they're referring this taxation question to the ballot. The board would have to vote on that. They would probably do that in the fall, if they did, sometime around August. And that can happen any year, really. It could have happened last year, it could happen this year, it could happen in future years. But that's really a decision that the board would make, and they would probably identify what it's specifically for. And this question will read, shall taxes be increased to do these things? And that's how that would look. And I think, whenever you do something like that, it's got to be compelling, because the community needs to feel like they need to know, like, I'm choosing to affirmatively raise my taxes, and then because I believe in this thing.
Yeah.
And that's how that would work. And DPS has the ability to do that with an override.
Many districts get more funding that way because they may have communities that are just more likely. They might have communities that are wealthier, that are more willing to pass an MLO.
Right.
Where does DPS sort of rank among them?
Yeah. So this is a sort of in the weeds answer I'm going to give you here, but I think there is a a sort of equity and fairness question that goes into play here. And it's like, because when you're
Yeah.
going to raise taxes, and this is normally a property tax, the communities that have the most property value, imagine
Sure.
that could be high-rise buildings like we have in Denver. It could be really profitable farmland or mining land in other communities.
Interesting.
But I think, the sort of technical way you could sort of assess that is say, what is the total economic value, assessed value in a community divided by the number of students? And then you could sort of understand the property value per student. And then DPS is sort of in the middle of the state on that.
Okay.
But the more property value we have per student, the easier it is to raise mill levy overrides, because it's going to be less of a burden. If DPS were to go out and raise another $40 million, which is about what the $43 million is what we're permitted to raise right now with a state cap on mill levy overrides, that would cost about $6 per month to the average person, or like $70 per year. So it's not nothing, but it's not an outrageous amount. In some communities, to raise $40 million would be a much higher amount. And so that's where there's some of this equity that I think is worthwhile conversation, that communities that is harder to generate revenue, they're at a legitimate disadvantage. That being said, DPS is sort of the middle of the pack, and our voters have been very generous.
Well, we'll see what happens this fall for sure. Thank you, Chuck, for mentioning so many ways that DPS is safeguarding, from retirement to making sure that funds are spent wisely and equitably, and that there is accountability. I want to know how your office is subject to oversight. I know that there are outside audits. You get a credit rating from an outside agency. So just like any company, someone else is looking out for how DPS is managing money.
There is a lot of regulation on how all public entities operate their finances. One of those things you mentioned is an annual audit is required. And so what we essentially have is a third party comes in and we open up all their books, and they basically can test anything. And then they come and report directly to the Board of Education in a public meeting about what they're finding. And, I take this very seriously. We spend really year round, we have these recurring meetings where we're sort of checking in, like, do we feel like we're ready for the audit? And that's part of what the accounting team is doing year round. So we've had clean audits ever since I've been here. And that's because we take it very seriously. I think that the audit is one of the clearest ways that we have accountability. I think I talk about regulation. One of the things is that the Colorado Open Records Act basically allows any citizen to basically say, show us your books on this type of thing. And you get a lot of these requests come in. Some of them are researchers. They'll say, show me every dollar you've spent, every transaction, every purchase order you've made. And sometimes it's researchers, sometimes it's people in the community, sometimes it's other folks. But every transaction that we have is subject to public scrutiny. And I think that's a second way. And then you mentioned a credit rating, and I think that's an external validation that I think is really notable. And DPS is a AA plus credit as an issuer, and then our bonds, because they have extra protection because they're directly funded by property taxes, have that added layer of protection, and so they're AAA. And so those are three of the main ways that I see it as citizens being able to look at this district, if they wanted to compare it to other districts, and get a sense of what are these the two external validations being the audit and the credit rating. And then I think, really literally every citizen could inspect our purchases.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, thank you for this overview that I hope was illuminating for people listening. And, for those people who weren't able to join the DPS 101 in-person course, essentially you got what is presented in that course. I wanted to get to some final thoughts here, just for someone who has spent their entire finance career in education, in the public sector like this. How do you see your role as affecting outcomes for students in DPS?
Well, thank you for this question. I don't think these things are separated at all. I mean, I haven't mentioned I'm a parent of 3 kids, and 2 of them are in the system, and one's too young to be in the system. But, I think that having a healthy organization, part of that is being healthy in your finances, allows these systems to work well. And a mismanaged or poorly managed operation from the financial standpoint means that you're not able do the things you need to do to be effective. You're not able to put money effectively, reliably. I mean, when you get into financial crises, you have a lot of challenges. You have to make hard decisions like, are we going to have pay freezes? Are we going to have layoffs? Are we going to have furlough days? Are we going to not update our curriculum that's 8 years old? And to me, running a healthy financial organization is one of the key enabling conditions for this system to work well for kids. And so to me, it's just absolutely essential. It's not a hard thread to me that what we're doing matters to educators, kids, parents, all the folks in the system.
Wonderful. Well, Chuck Carpenter, again, Chief of Finances for DPS, thank you so much for joining us for the DPS 101 podcast. We will continue this series. In fact, next time you'll be hearing from my boss, Chief of Communications, Bill Good. And I think what's fun about my job is we get to go into schools all the time and see the results of your job, Chuck. What you pointed out, the thing. I was in a school today where they're putting on a musical production, and listening to you talk, I thought about all the ways that costumes and
of course,
and everything for those kids to get to do that theater production that means so much to them. They need funds to do that. So we thank you for managing the money for DPS. And we'll see you next time on DPS 101.